In the spring of 1935, with the Great Depression grinding the country into dust, Smith & Wesson hand-fitted its very first .357 Magnum revolver and shipped it to a single man, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. The price was $60. In a year when a working man might earn $20 a week, that revolver cost nearly a month of wages and roughly a quarter more than any other handgun the company built. It was not a weapon for the masses. It was a numbered, registered, hand-polished instrument, and the man who drove its creation, Major Douglas Wesson, grandson of one of the company's founders, spent the years that followed carrying his .357 into the field after game, from woodchucks to walrus. Read that again. The most mythologized self-defense cartridge in American history was born as a premium hunting and target gun. 90 years later, almost nobody remembers that. The firearms industry buried that origin beneath a single, profitable phrase, stopping power. And it sold the very same myth about the .45 ACP. 2 legendary cartridges, 2 reputations carved in granite, and a layer of marketing so thick that most shooters have never once measured the truth for themselves. This is HuntForge. Today, the .357 Magnum and the .45 ACP go into the same room, under the same hard light, and every claim gets checked against the men who actually studied the question. Army surgeons, federal investigators, and the data from nearly 2,000 real shootings. The verdict is coming. But the verdict means nothing until you understand what was hidden and who profited from keeping it hidden. Every cartridge is an answer to a question written in blood. To understand what these 2 rounds are, you have to understand the wars that demanded them. The .45 ACP was forged in the jungles of the Philippines. At the turn of the 20th century, American soldiers fighting Moro warriors found their standard .38 long Colt revolvers shamefully inadequate. Determined fighters absorbed hit after hit and kept coming. The Army's response was not a slogan. It was a study. In 1904, Colonel John T. Thompson, the same Thompson whose name would later ride on the Thompson submachine gun, and Major Louis Anatole-LaGarde of the Army Medical Corps ran a brutal series of terminal tests on live cattle and human cadavers at the Chicago stockyards. Their conclusion was specific. Nothing smaller than a .45 caliber bullet would deliver the stopping the Army needed. John Moses Browning answered the call, enlarging a .41 caliber design into the .45 caliber model 1905, and on March 29, 1911, the cartridge and its pistol were adopted as the model 1911. The .45 ACP was built for one thing: to put a man down, up close, in war. The .357 Magnum was forged on American highways. By the early 1930s, Prohibition-era criminals were hiding behind automobile bodies and the first crude ballistic vests, and the police were losing the exchange. Colt's .38 Super was the only round that could reliably punch through a car door, and Smith & Wesson refused to come second. Working with Winchester, and leaning on the hard-won experience of a rancher and gunwriter named Elmer Keith, the company stretched the .38 special case by 1/8 of an inch, raised the pressure ceiling, and by 1934 had finalized a cartridge that drove a 158-grain bullet past 1,500 feet per second. That extra 1/8 of an inch was not for power. It was a deliberate safety lock, making it physically impossible to chamber this high-pressure round in an older, weaker .38 special revolver and blow the gun apart. One cartridge was built to end a charging man in a trench. The other was built to defeat a steel car door on a city street. Neither was built for the job most owners now buy it for. Hold on to that. Here is what most comparison videos will never tell you, because it indicts the very people who pay for them. For most of the 20th century, the men selling ammunition did not sell penetration, and they did not sell shot placement. They sold a feeling. A salesman would walk into a police armory, set a box on the table, and announce that the round had knockdown power, or stopping power. Phrases that sound like physics but mean precisely nothing. No instrument on Earth measures knockdown power. It cannot be defined, weighed, or repeated in a test. It was never science. It was advertising dressed in the language of science. And the gun press amplified it until it became gospel. In 1992, 2 writers, Evan Marshall and Edwin Sanow, published a book called Handgun Stopping Power and sold it for $39 to a generation hungry for a definitive answer. Their tables crowned the .357, Magnum's 125-grain load with a one-shot stop rating above 90%, a near-magic number that made the .357 the most feared handgun cartridge in America and moved an ocean of premium ammunition. There was only one problem. The people who actually study what bullets do to bodies could not reproduce it. When statisticians and wound-ballistics researchers examined the data, they found figures that could not have been gathered the way the authors claimed. One celebrated dataset Sanow promoted, the so-called Strasbourg goat tests, matched his earlier numbers so suspiciously that analysts concluded the result could not be explained by any honest method. Critics pointed to the author's close ties to companies that sold exactly the lightweight, high-velocity bullets their tables happened to favor. To the scientists, the definitive study was an advertisement wearing a lab coat. Step back and measure the machine that kept the myth breathing. The American firearm and ammunition industry generated $91.7 billion in total economic impact in 2024. A story that sells premium ammunition to tens of millions of people is not an accident. It is a business model. And the first casualty of that business model was the plain truth about which cartridge actually does what. The man who pulled the curtain back wore a United States Army uniform, Colonel Martin Fackler was a combat surgeon who directed the wound-ballistics laboratory at the Letterman Army Institute of Research, and he is the closest thing this country has ever produced to a father of modern wound ballistics. He spent his career cutting into the exact question the marketers had always waved away, and his findings were merciless to the mythology. Kinetic energy, Fackler demonstrated, does not wound. The temporary cavity, the dramatic tissue stretch the energy crowd worships, is, in handgun terms, secondary at best. What actually stops a threat is the permanent wound channel, the tissue the bullet physically crushes, and how deep that destruction reaches. He pioneered the 10% ordnance gelatin standard still used in laboratories today, and he set a floor the industry's velocity worship had ignored. A defensive bullet must reach at least 12 inches to be trusted. Then, reality forced the argument into the open. On the morning of April 11, 1986, in a suburb of Miami, 8 FBI agents fought 2 heavily armed robbers in what became the bloodiest shootout in the Bureau's history. In the first minute, Special Agent Jerry Dove placed a 9mm round into the lead attacker. It severed an artery and tore into his lung, and it stopped roughly an inch and a half short of his heart. The man kept fighting for nearly 4 more minutes and killed 2 agents before he was finally put down. That round had not failed to be powerful. It had failed to penetrate deep enough. That failure ended the era of taking a manufacturer's word for it. The FBI commissioned its own research, and in 1989 it set the verdict down in writing in a report titled Handgun Wounding Factors and Effectiveness. The language is blunt enough to frame on a wall. The shock of bullet impact, it states, is a fable, and knockdown power is a myth. The critical element is penetration. Read that one more time, because 2 agents died learning it. The most powerful institution in American law enforcement studied the question the marketers had answered with a slogan and concluded the slogan was empty. So strip away the myth and lay the 2 cartridges on the table as physics, not poetry. The .357 Magnum is the velocity argument. A 125-grain hollow point leaves a 4-inch barrel at roughly 1,450 feet per second, carrying close to 580 foot-pounds of energy, and at 50 yards, it still strikes harder than many cartridges manage at the muzzle. On the raw numbers, the .45 ACP cannot touch it. The classic 230-grain load ambles out at about 850 feet per second and 350 to 400 foot-pounds, climbing toward 460 in a hotter plus P loading. The energy gap is real, and it is not close. The .357 hits harder. That much is not in dispute. But Fackler's science already told you energy is not the question. Penetration and the wound channel are, and here the picture quietly inverts. A premium .45 ACP hollow point. The Federal HST is the benchmark. Opens to roughly 85/100ths of an inch, nearly double its original diameter, and comes to rest in about 14.5 inches of gelatin. That lands dead center in the FBI's 12 to 18-inch window. It expands wide, it crushes a broad channel, and it stays inside the target where its work belongs. The .357 Magnum's blistering speed becomes, in a defensive setting, a liability as often as an asset. Independent gelatin testing of .357 loads found underpenetration almost non-existent, but several loads punched clean past 16 inches, far enough that testers had to stack a second block of gelatin just to catch the bullet. A round that exits a threat and keeps traveling is a round looking for a wall, and for whoever is standing in the room behind it. Then there is recoil, which the spec sheet never shows you. A full power. 357 in a lightweight revolver delivers a sharp, snapping 10 foot-pounds of recoil energy, paired with a muzzle blast and flash that punish the shooter under stress. The .45 ACP, fired from a heavy steel pistol whose reciprocating slide absorbs the impulse, pushes back with a slow, rolling 7 or 8 foot-pounds. It is the difference between a slap and a shove. And once you accept that no handgun reliably ends a fight with a single shot, the cartridge that lets you place a fast, accurate second shot is doing more honest work than the one that flinches you off target. This is the part the loyalists on both sides skip, because it humbles all of them at once. A firearms instructor and researcher named Greg Ellifritz spent 10 years doing what Marshall and Sanow only claim to do. He assembled documented data from nearly 1,800 real shootings, recording caliber, shot placement, and outcome, with no ammunition company paying his bills. His findings should be carved into the counter of every gun store in America. Among the common defensive calibers: the .38, the 9mm, the .40, the .45. The share of attackers incapacitated by a single solid hit to the torso or head varied by only about 8 percentage points. The .45 ACP put a man down with one shot about 51% of the time and needed roughly 2 hits on average to end the fight. The .357 came in higher, near 61% and about 1 7/10 rounds. Though honesty demands a footnote, because Ellifritz grouped the .357 Magnum together with the .357 SIG in a noticeably smaller sample. A genuine edge, then, but not a death ray, and nowhere near the 90% fantasy the magazines were selling. Ellifritz himself urged caution with the thinner samples, and that caution is the whole point. The brutal truth buried under decades of caliber war is this: between two serious defensive rounds, the difference is measured in single percentage points. What decides the fight is where the bullet goes and how deep it reaches. Exactly what Fackler proved in his laboratory, exactly what the FBI paid for in blood on a Miami street. Or, as Clint Smith, the founder of the Thunder Ranch Shooting Academy, has put it for decades, the purpose of a handgun is to fight your way back to your long gun, which is the perfect place to talk about the one thing these two cartridges do not share. Honesty cuts both ways, and the .45 ACP earns real ground here that no .357 loyalist should be allowed to wave off. The .45 lives in the semi-automatic pistol, and that platform is a true advantage. A modern double-stack pistol carries 13 to 15 rounds of .45 and Fano. 45 and reloads in about 2 seconds. A defensive revolver carries 6. In a fight where round count matters, 15 against 6 is not a debate, and pretending otherwise is the same brand of myth-making this whole story is about. Quality semi-autos have grown so reliable across 30 years that the old line about revolvers never jamming is mostly nostalgia now. But the revolver holds one card the slide gun cannot trump, and it is mechanical, not mystical. Press the muzzle of a semi-automatic pistol hard against an attacker at contact distance, and the slide gets shoved out of battery. The gun falls silent and will not fire. The revolver does not care. Jam its barrel into a chest, pull the heavy double-action trigger, and the cylinder turns and the round fires, again and again, until the gun is empty. At arm's length, in the worst 5 seconds of a person's life, that mechanical certainty is its own kind of power. So the platform question, like everything else here, refuses a tidy slogan. The .45 ACP hands you capacity and speed. The .357 revolver hands you absolute reliability when the muzzle is touching the threat. Both of those things are true at the same moment, and the catalog will never print them on the same page. Now step out of the city, out of the trench, off the highway, and walk into the woods. Because this is where the .357 Magnum reveals the thing the industry worked hardest to bury, for the simple reason that there is no magic bullet markup in telling the truth about it. The .45 ACP, for all its honest defensive virtue, is a cul-de-sac. It drops like a stone past 100 yards. It was never designed to hunt, and no amount of +P loading turns it into a field cartridge. You buy a .45, you shoot a .45, and that is the entire relationship. It is a specialist, and a magnificent one, inside the close range it was born for. The .357 Magnum refuses to be put in a box, and it does so by returning to the exact purpose Major Wesson built it for. Chamber that same cartridge in a lever-action carbine, a Marlin, a Henry, a Rossi, and something the spec sheet hides comes alive. Close the cylinder gap, add 16 inches of barrel, and the slow Magnum powders that never finished burning in a revolver finally burn to completion. A 125-grain bullet that left a handgun at 1,450 feet per second can leave a rifle muzzle well past 2,000. Stout hard-cast loads drive a 180-grain bullet beyond 1,850 feet per second and over 1,300 foot-pounds of energy. You have not bought a handgun round anymore. You have bought a 150-yard deer and hog rifle that happens to share a chamber with your sidearm. Frank Barnes, the engineer behind the reference work Cartridges of the World, rated the .357 among the finest all-around handgun hunting cartridges for small and medium game. And in a carbine, with the right bullet, it climbs into honest black bear country. And it teaches. Load that same revolver or carbine with mild .38 special, and a new shooter builds grip, trigger control, and confidence on cheap, gentle ammunition before ever stepping up to a full Magnum. One firearm, 2 cartridges, a built-in ladder that runs from a beginner's first range day to the backcountry. The .45 ACP has no companion round and no such ladder. The .357 does not merely defend. It hunts. It trains. It reaches across an open field. It feeds a family through a hard winter. It does every bit of that because it was a hunter's cartridge first and a legend second. So here is the verdict, and it is not the one either tribe wants to hear. The .45 ACP is not the loser of this story. It is one of the most honest cartridges ever designed. A close-range defensive round that does exactly what a 1904 Army study asked of it, with controlled penetration, reliable expansion, and recoil an ordinary person can master. It earned its legend the hard way, across 2 world wars and a century of holsters, and anyone who carries one for the work it was built for is well armed and well served. But the title promised a brutal truth, so here it stands. The thing no one at the gun counter talks about is not which round hits harder. It is that harder was always the wrong question. A question the industry invented so it could sell you a feeling in place of a fact. Measured by the only things that turned out to matter, penetration, placement, and breadth of honest use. The .357 Magnum is the more complete cartridge. Not because it strikes like a hammer, but because it was a working hunter's tool that the marketers dressed up as a magic man-stopper and then conveniently forgot to mention you could put it in a rifle. Go back to that workbench in 1935 and the $60 revolver Major Wesson carried into the field after game. That is the true face of the .357 Magnum. Not the one-shot stop fantasy printed on a magazine cover, but a hunting gun honest enough to admit exactly what it is. And here, for one line only, this narrator will set the third person down. For years, this channel repeated those stopping power numbers as gospel too, and I was wrong to do it, before the record finally proved them hollow. That is not a comfortable thing to say out loud. But measuring the truth for yourself, instead of swallowing whatever the catalog prints, is the entire reason this channel exists. And that is who HuntForge is built for. If you are the kind of hunter who trusts a chronograph and a block of gelatin over a slogan stamped on a box, who would rather know the truth than merely feel powerful, then you already belong here. Subscribe. Not as a courtesy, but as a declaration of which side of that line you choose to stand on. Because in the end, you do not pick the cartridge with the loudest reputation. You pick the one whose truth you have measured with your own 2 hands.